One wrong step, and everything comes crashing down. That night, as I slipped out of the house, the moon a silent witness, I felt a rush unlike any other. The thrill of doing something so recklessly forbidden was intoxicating. I was meeting Tom, a colleague, who'd become much more over the past few months. His charm was irresistible, and our stolen glances had finally culminated into this secret rendezvous. We ended up at this swanky hotel downtown. It was the kind of place I'd only seen in glossy magazines. Every moment with Tom was a blur of laughter and whispered promises, a stark contrast to the mundanity of my married life. We were two lost souls finding solace in each other, or so it felt in those fleeting hours. There was no talk of tomorrow, no whispers of the lives we were momentarily escaping from. Just us, in our little bubble, insulated from reality. Reality, however, has a cruel way of bursting bubbles. I snuck back home just as the first light of dawn was breaking, my heart racing, my mind a jumble of emotions. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the sight that greeted me. There was Mark, my husband of 10 years, sitting in the dark living room, an aura of calm fury about him. His eyes, usually so warm and loving, were cold and accusatory. He didn't need to say a word. The evidence was there for all to see. Pictures, texts, a digital trail of my betrayal laid bare on the coffee table. I felt my world start to spin as Mark's voice cut through the silence, each word laced with hurt and anger. He talked about trust, about family, about how I had shattered everything we had built together. The next moments were a blur. Voices raised, accusations hurled, our little home turned into a battlefield of broken hearts. And then, the unthinkable, Mark, packing a bag for himself and our 2 kids, his face set in determination. I watched, frozen, as he walked out the door with our children in tow, leaving me in a house that suddenly felt too big, too empty. I was alone, the silence deafening, the weight of my choices crushing. In seeking a momentary escape, I had set into motion a chain of events that would change our lives forever. As I sat there amidst the ruins of my life, I realized the true cost of my actions. Regret is a strange thing. It creeps up on you slowly, then all at once, leaving you to grapple with the what-ifs and could-have-beens. That night, I lost more than just my husband and kids. I lost a part of myself, a part one feared I would never get back. The tightrope had snapped, and I was in freefall, with no safety net in sight. Sometimes, life hits you with a storm just when you've forgotten your umbrella. That's how I felt the morning I realized Mark had blocked my number. I kept calling, each attempt a desperate plea for a chance to explain, to apologize, to mend what I'd broken. But all I got was that impersonal, robotic voice telling me the number I had dialed was no longer in service. It felt like a punch in the gut, the final confirmation that I was now an outsider to my own family. Dragging myself to work, I hoped for some semblance of normalcy, a distraction from the chaos of my personal life. But as I walked through those familiar doors, I felt 100 eyes on me, whispers trailing in my wake. The rumor mill had been busy, and my affair was now the hottest topic. Colleagues who used to greet me with warm smiles now offered nothing but cold shoulders and judgmental glares. The worst part? Tom, the man for whom I'd risked it all, began to retreat into the shadows. Our once passionate encounters turned into awkward exchanges. He avoided eye contact, took different routes to avoid bumping into me. His distance was like salt on an open wound, a cruel reminder of my solitude in this self-created mess. Then came the call from Sarah, my rock, my confidant. "I just can't condone what you've done," she said, her voice a mix of anger and disappointment. That call ended with a click that echoed the shattering of our years of friendship. I was losing my allies, one by one, left to navigate this storm alone. But the universe wasn't done with me yet. In the middle of a Tuesday that was already dragging, I received an envelope, not through the mail, but hand-delivered to my desk for all to see. Divorce papers, stark and official, with infidelity cited as the reason. My private life, now a public spectacle, laid bare for my colleagues' prying eyes. I could feel their stares, almost hear their thoughts. There I was, the woman who had it all and threw it away for a fleeting affair. Each of these events was a blow, knocking the wind out of me, leaving me to grapple with the reality of my situation. I had become the architect of my downfall, brick by brick, decision by decision. The life I had known, the life I had loved, was crumbling around me, and all I could do was watch, helpless and alone. In those moments, staring at the pieces of a life I had shattered, I realized the magnitude of my actions. The hurt I had caused, the trust I had broken, the lives I had upended. It was a painful awakening, a harsh lesson in the consequences of our choices. I had set myself adrift, and now I had to navigate these troubled waters, with no compass, no map, and no one to guide me. The day my parents found out about the affair felt like being trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Their voices on the phone were a mix of disbelief and heartache. My father, a man of few words, uttered a simple, "We are disappointed in you," that hit harder than any shouting could. My mother, always the emotional anchor, was reduced to tears. It was the first time I had ever heard her cry because of something I'd done. That conversation ended with a heavy silence that said more than any words ever could. With the divorce looming like a dark cloud, I started the daunting task of finding a lawyer. Call after call, I was either politely declined or quoted exorbitant fees. My scandal, it seemed, was too public, too messy for most to touch. The few willing to represent me were either inexperienced or opportunistic, seeing my case as a high-profile feather in their cap rather than a life-altering crisis for me. Work, once my refuge from domestic struggles, became another battlefield. My boss, citing the company's image and team dynamics, demoted me. I was stripped of my hard-earned position, watching years of dedication crumble to dust. The pay cut that followed was a harsh blow, adding financial strain to my already fractured world. In my desperation to reconnect with my children, I turned to old-school methods. I penned letters filled with apologies and love, sent their favorite toys and books. Each parcel was sent with a glimmer of hope, only to be returned unopened, unacknowledged. Mark's silent message was clear. I was cut off, not just from him, but from our kids too. But the universe wasn't done with me yet. My phone, once a lifeline to friends and family, became a source of dread. Unknown numbers bombarded me with texts and calls, spewing hatred and threats. Each notification was a jolt of fear, a reminder of the public scrutiny and judgment I was under. I began to look over my shoulder, jump at shadows. Was someone following me? Who were these faceless accusers hiding behind their screens? The isolation was suffocating, the judgment unrelenting. My personal life had become public fodder, my mistakes a spectacle for all to see and condemn. The support system I had relied on for so long was gone, replaced by a void filled with whispers, stares, and the relentless buzzing of my phone. In those days, I felt like a ghost wandering through the ruins of my former life. Each step was a reminder of what I had lost, each breath a struggle against the tide of despair. I was a woman unmoored, drifting in a sea of my own making, with no lighthouse to guide me home. And so, I trudged on, each day a battle against the wave of consequences that threatened to pull me under. The fight for redemption, for forgiveness, was just beginning, and I was already weary. But in the depths of that despair, there was a glimmer of determination, a stubborn refusal to let this be the end of my story. You know how they say that sometimes life can't get any worse, and then it does. Well, they're right. I found that out the hard way one chilly morning when I saw my car. It was no longer just a car, it was a canvas of hate. Cheater was sprayed across it in big, bold, red letters. My heart sank. It felt like the whole world was screaming my mistake back at me. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, their eyes full of a mix of pity and disdain. That was just the beginning. The financial fallout from the scandal hit me like a freight train. My once comfortable lifestyle, supported by a well-paying job, was a thing of the past. The mortgage on our beautiful home, once a symbol of our happy family life, became an unbearable burden. I had no choice but to let it go. Saying goodbye to that house was like closing the book on the life I once knew and loved. So, I moved into a small, run-down apartment in a part of town I'd previously only driven through. The peeling paint, the creaky floors, and the faint musty smell were a far cry from the polished floors and manicured lawns I was used to. It was more than a change of address. It was a stark reminder of how far I'd fallen. Amidst all this, my mental health began to spiral. Sleepless nights became my new normal. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling of my cramped apartment, my mind racing with thoughts of my children, the life I'd lost, and the public shaming. I was isolated, cut off from friends and family, and the constant barrage of hateful messages didn't help. I started to crumble under the weight of my own thoughts, my own guilt. Then came the first divorce hearing. Walking into that courtroom felt like stepping into a lion's den. Mark's lawyer painted me as the villain, the homewrecker, the heartless cheater. Every word felt like a blow, stripping away layers of my dignity. I wanted to shout, to say that there was more to the story, that I wasn't just this one-dimensional character they were portraying. But in the sea of judgmental faces, my voice was a mere whisper, drowned out by the narrative they had chosen for me. Sitting there, in that cold, impersonal room, I realized how alone I was. I had become the antagonist in my own life story, a role I never intended to play. The hearing was a blur of legal jargon and cold, hard facts that omitted the complexities of human emotions, of why people do what they do. It was black and white in a world I knew was filled with shades of gray. As I walked out of the courtroom, the weight of the day's events heavy on my shoulders, I realized this was just the beginning. The battle for my dignity, for a chance to rebuild, was going to be a long and arduous one. But in that moment of overwhelming despair, there was a tiny spark of defiance, a quiet voice that whispered, "This is not the end." And so, I trudged back to my new reality, to my small, dingy apartment in a forgotten part of town. I was a woman broken, but not defeated. The journey ahead was uncertain, the path uncharted, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to keep moving forward, one step at a time. The day the court granted Mark full custody of our kids, it felt like a part of me died. The judge's words echoed in my head, unstable lifestyle and recent actions, like a relentless drumbeat of failure. I wanted to scream, to argue, to explain that I was more than just my worst mistake. But the courtroom was not a place for emotions, it was a place of cold, hard facts. And the facts were against me. Back in my rundown apartment, the loneliness was suffocating. It was there, in that cramped, dimly lit space, that I started receiving anonymous letters. The first one caught me off guard, a nasty note filled with accusations and threats. More followed, each one more hateful than the last. I'd always been a strong person, but these letters chipped away at my resilience. I was scared, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering who out there hated me enough to do this. As the stress mounted, my health began to suffer. Meals went uneaten, nights were restless, and the mirror reflected a stranger gaunt, hollow-eyed, a shell of my former self. Stress has a way of creeping up on you, tightening its grip until you're gasping for air. That's how I felt, struggling to keep my head above water in a sea of my own making. In the midst of all this, Tom, the man I thought was my partner in crime, my confidant in this chaotic journey, turned his back on me. One day, his number was just gone. Changed. And at work, he was transferred to a different department. Our paths, once so entwined, were now forcibly diverged. The realization hit me hard. I was truly alone. The one person who had been a part of this whole affair was now just a ghost, a reminder of a life that once was. In desperation, I reached out to old friends, hoping to rekindle some connection, to find some semblance of support. But one by one, they turned me away. Some politely declined my calls, others bluntly stated they couldn't associate with someone like me. The rejection was a bitter pill to swallow. I had become a pariah, an outcast in my own community. Sitting alone in my apartment, surrounded by the remnants of a life in disarray, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I'd fallen. From a loving family and a bustling social life to a lonely existence marred by scandal and shame. It was a hard reality to face, a bitter lesson in the consequences of choices and the fragility of relationships. But even in the darkest moments, there's a flicker of hope, a stubborn spark that refuses to be extinguished. And so, I clung to that hope, however faint it might have been. It was a hope not for a return to the past, but for the strength to face the future, however uncertain and daunting it may be. In that tiny, dim apartment, I began to realize that the road to redemption, to healing, starts with oneself. It was a road I was just beginning to walk, a journey of 1,000 miles that started with a single, faltering step forward. Just when I thought my life couldn't get more complicated, I found out I was pregnant. There it was, the little plus sign staring back at me, as if to say, surprise. Here's another twist. It wasn't just any baby, it was Tom's. In the middle of all this chaos, a new life was growing inside me. It felt surreal, like a plot twist in a dramatic soap opera, except it was my life. I decided to keep the baby. Call it a maternal instinct or a desperate need for a fresh start, but in my heart, I knew this was my chance to turn a new leaf. A tiny sliver of hope in an otherwise dark world. But, as news tends to do in small towns, it leaked. Instead of support, I was met with more judgment and scorn. My already tarnished public image took another hit. Irresponsible, they called me. Reckless. It felt like the whole world was against me and my unborn child. My health, both mental and physical, started to deteriorate. Sleepless nights spent wrestling with guilt and fear, days filled with anxiety and loneliness. It all became too much. My doctor, seeing my distress, advised me to take a leave of absence from work. So, I stepped back from the job that had been my pride for so long, retreating further into my shell. I had hoped, perhaps naively, that my parents would stand by me through this storm. But when I told them about the pregnancy, their response was a resounding no. "You've brought enough shame upon us," they said. Their words cut deep, severing what little connection we had left. I was not just a disappointment. I had become a stranger to them, an outsider to my own flesh and blood. In a last-ditch effort to find some semblance of peace, I started attending therapy sessions. I'd sit there, week after week, pouring my heart out to a stranger, trying to untangle the web of emotions I was caught in. But each session ended with me feeling just as lost and broken as before. The guilt was a constant companion, a heavy shadow that followed me everywhere. I was drowning in a sea of my own making, and therapy felt like grasping at straws, trying to hold on to something, anything, that might keep me afloat. Sitting in my small, dingy apartment, alone with my thoughts and the life growing inside me, I realized just how far I had strayed from the path I once walked. My choices had led me here, to this point of no return. The future was a foggy landscape, uncertain and intimidating. But amidst the chaos, there was a tiny heartbeat, a reminder that life, no matter how broken, goes on. And so, I clung to that, the heartbeat of my unborn child, a symbol of hope, of new beginnings. It was a daunting journey ahead, one filled with unknowns and challenges. But it was a journey I had to take, a path I had to walk. It was my chance to rebuild, to create something beautiful from the ashes of my past. Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you do, please take a moment to hit that like button. It really helps me out and lets me know you appreciate the content. Also, if you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel. Subscribing is a great way to stay updated with all the latest videos and to be part of our growing community. It's quick, it's free, and it ensures you won't miss out on any upcoming content. So go ahead, smash that like button and hit subscribe. Your support means a lot and keeps this channel going. Thanks for watching. Life, I've learned, can throw curveballs when you least expect it. The day I received the legal notice for child support payments was one of those curveballs. I stared at the document, the words blurring before my eyes. Mark was asking for child support, and there I was, barely making ends meet with my reduced salary. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man I once shared a life with, now a distant, cold figure in a courtroom, demanding money I didn't have. Things spiraled even further when I lost my car. Missed payments led to repossession, and just like that, I was left without transportation. That car was more than just a vehicle. It was a symbol of my independence, a lifeline to the outside world. Its absence left a void, making my already challenging life even more difficult. But the hardest blow was yet to come. Amidst this turmoil, I suffered a miscarriage. The loss was indescribable. I was alone, dealing with the physical and emotional pain of losing a child I never got to meet. The little heartbeat that had been my beacon of hope in the darkness was gone. I plunged into a state of depression, deeper and darker than anything I'd ever experienced. The loneliness was all-consuming, a constant reminder of everything I had lost. Word of my miscarriage somehow made its way into the public domain. It's strange how tragedy can soften even the hardest of hearts. Some acquaintances, who had previously turned their backs on me, now reached out with words of sympathy. But their condolences felt hollow, a band-aid over a wound too deep to heal. It was a brief respite in a world that had been relentlessly cruel. Just when I thought I had experienced the full spectrum of betrayal, Mark's sister, whom I had always considered a friend, turned against me. Her words on social media were like daggers. "She's getting what she deserves," she wrote, and with those words, she opened the floodgates for a new wave of hate and judgment. It was a public denouncement, a clear message that I was on my own. Sitting in my empty apartment, the walls seemed to close in on me. The weight of the legal battles, the loss of my unborn child, the public shaming, it was a relentless onslaught of misfortune. I felt like a shipwrecked sailor, clinging to the wreckage of my former life, adrift in a sea of sorrow and regret. But in the midst of this darkness, there was a glimmer of resolve. The adversity, as crushing as it was, sparked a stubborn flame within me. I realized that to survive, to move forward, I had to find strength I didn't know I had. It was a daunting task, rebuilding from the rubble of my shattered life. But it was a challenge I had to accept, a journey I had to embark on. I was down, but not out. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with obstacles and setbacks. But it was a road I was determined to walk. It was time to pick up the pieces, to forge a new path out of the chaos. The journey of healing and redemption was about to begin, and I was ready to take the first step. There's a saying that when it rains, it pours. Never has that felt more true than the day I was evicted from my apartment. The landlord was sympathetic but firm. I was months behind on rent. I packed my few belongings and moved into a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. The room smelled of cigarettes and stale dreams, a far cry from the home I once had. It was a tangible reminder of how far I'd fallen. Seeking some semblance of healing, I started attending counseling sessions at a local community center. The counselor was kind, her words gentle, but they barely scratched the surface of my deep-seated sense of loss. I'd sit there, nodding and sharing, but the void inside me remained unfilled. It was like putting a band-aid on a wound that needed stitches. Driven by necessity, I tried my hand at starting an online business. I had big ideas but little experience. The venture was doomed from the start. It fizzled out as quickly as it began, leaving me with more debt and disappointment. Each failure was a blow to my already fragile self-esteem. Then came the news that felt like a dagger through my heart. Mark was moving to another state with our kids. Any faint hope I had of mending our family was now gone. The distance wasn't just physical, it was a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. The realization that I might never be a part of their daily lives again was crushing. One day, a former colleague visited me. "Everyone at work feels sorry for you," she said, her eyes full of pity. That pity was more humiliating than any scorn or anger I'd faced. I was a subject of workplace gossip, a cautionary tale of what not to become. In a desperate attempt to make sense of my life, I started writing a journal. Pouring my thoughts onto paper brought a small measure of relief. It was like talking to an old friend, one who wouldn't judge or abandon me. Writing became my therapy, my safe haven in a world that felt increasingly hostile. But the stress of the past months took its toll on my health. I was diagnosed with a chronic stress-related illness. It was as if my body was manifesting the turmoil of my mind. Each day became a struggle, a battle against my own body. My lawyer had more bad news. "You have little chance of winning favorable terms in the divorce," he said. The final court hearing granted me limited supervised visitation rights with my children. But when I tried to see them, they refused. The pain in their eyes was evident, a mix of anger and hurt that I had caused. In a last-ditch effort to stay afloat, I sold most of my remaining possessions. Each item carried a memory, a piece of a life that was no longer mine. The sales brought in just enough to cover some of my debts, but it felt like selling off pieces of my soul. I joined a support group for people who had lost everything. There, I found a community of broken souls, each with their own story of loss and resilience. It was comforting and heartbreaking in equal measure. One evening, walking back to the motel, I was mugged. They took the little money I had, leaving me bruised and shaken on the sidewalk. It was a physical and symbolic blow, stripping me of the last shreds of security I had clung to. In a moment of weakness, I reached out to Tom. But he had moved on, engaged to someone else. His request for me not to contact him again was the final cut, severing the last tie I had to the life I once lived. Now, here I am, sitting alone in this dingy motel room. The journey from that one night of indiscretion to this point has been long and painful. I reflect on everything I've lost, my family, my home, my dignity. It's a story of descent, a tale of how one mistake can unravel the fabric of a life. But it's also a story of survival, however grim. In the depths of despair, I've found a resilience I never knew I had. The road ahead is uncertain, filled with challenges and unknowns. But it's a road I must walk, one step at a time. This is not the end of my story. It's a new, albeit difficult,